Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very senior professional from the world of academia, an author from USA, Mr. Greg Satell. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I will say, though, I'm not an academic.
Okay.
I spent most of my career managing organizations.
Okay, I stand corrected. Greg is an author, and all of you know I have always been very partial to authors, and we'll talk about his books. He's an author of 2 books, Cascades and Mapping Innovation. He's a lecturer at the Wharton School. He's a global transformation and a change expert, and Greg has been ranked as one of the top innovation bloggers in the world. So, Greg, let me start by asking you to tell me about your own journey in brief.
Well, it's kind of a funny thing because early in my career, I was invited to go work in Eastern Europe, in Poland. And I was an athlete in college, so never did a semester abroad or anything like that. And I looked at the guy in the office next to me, who was about 10 years older than me and made a bit more money and had a longer commute, but did pretty much the same job that I did. And I said, well, if I don't do something like this now, I'll never do it. And so I figured I'd go out for 6 months. And 6 months turned into 15 years in Poland, mostly in Poland and Ukraine, but also in Russia and Turkey. And it completely changed my life.
Right.
And anybody who's ever read my books will see it really had a deep, deep influence on me. And I had a lot of fun, but I learned a lot.
Fascinating. So let's now talk about your books, Cascades and Mapping Innovation. And before I ask you any questions, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Greg Satell's books on Amazon. I will go and check them out myself. So let me start by asking you to give us a brief overview of both your books.
Well, it's kind of, let me tell you a little bit of the story behind both of the books. So in 2009, when the world was coming to an end, and in Ukraine, it was really bad, I started a blog, and the blog really took off, and it got picked up by Forbes and Harvard Business Review. So a book seemed like the next logical step. My first 3 attempts to get Cascades published all failed. And the process for getting a book published is pretty brutal. It's geared towards rejection.
Correct.
So to get an agent, most of them reject you. If one accepts you, then you're okay. And then once you get an agent, you start sending out proposals to publishers, most of which reject. And if one accepts you, then you're okay.
Absolutely.
And I went through that process 3 times. And I got agents, but no publishers. I was rejected by each and every one, dozens and dozens of times, which is just brutal.
Absolutely.
And then I had kind of a brain fart. And that brain fart became Mapping Innovation. And I got an agent to accept me, and all the publishers rejected me, but one accepted. And Mapping Innovation was a huge success.
Wow.
And because of the success of Mapping Innovation, I was able to get Cascades published, which is the book I really wanted to write. So Mapping Innovation was about a problem I'd long wanted to solve. And that was, how do you innovate? Because running organizations, whenever I looked for guidance about how to innovate, everybody had a different idea. you look and you and I were talking about how we like to read CEO biographies, and you go and you look at Steve Jobs and you see how he innovates. You say, well, that must be the way to do it, because if Steve Jobs innovates that way, that's obviously, you know, the successful path. But then you look at Google, and Google does it a completely different way. And you look at Amazon, and they do it a different way as well.
Absolutely.
And so this was the problem I was trying to solve. And what I found is that innovation is really about solving problems. And there's as many ways to innovate as there are different problems to solve. So the key to innovating successfully is to figure out what type of problem you're trying to solve, and then to match that with the method that's most likely to be successful. And I developed an innovation matrix that's proven very, very helpful in helping people to do that. And that was essentially what mapping innovation was.
Amazing. So now tell me a little bit about Cascades. You know, and I must mention that this is the first time I've met a published author who says, to get my first book published, I also wrote a second one. And then that's fantastic. And congratulations on that, on both these books.
Well, I do think that people don't communicate how hard it is.
Absolutely.
And they don't communicate the defeats. And they say, I did this and I did that, and everything's wonderful. Things aren't wonderful.
I know.
You don't go from success to success.
Correct.
It's not a straight line. You have, you know, you take your hits along the way, and that's part of it. And you have to be willing to take the hits.
Correct.
But so Cascades is actually a much more interesting story. I spent most of my career managing media companies. And in 2004, I was managing among other things, a major news organization in Kyiv, Ukraine, during the Orange Revolution. And what struck me, it was one of those moments where the universe opens up a little bit and reveals itself. And you realize that the world doesn't work the way you thought it did. I had thought, as most people do, I think, that, you know, there's certain power in the world that organizes things, and there's a way. And what struck me about the Orange Revolution is nobody who had any conventional form of power had any ability at all to shape events. Nobody really understood what was going on or what would happen next. Not the journalist I would speak to in the newsroom every day, not the other business leaders, and certainly not the political leaders. There was just this mysterious force that seemed to be moving events along. And what amazed me was how thousands upon thousands of people who'd ordinarily be doing very different things would stop what they were doing and start doing the same thing all at once in nearly perfect unison. And running a large organization at the time, I thought to myself, and you as a longtime leader, I'm sure you've had this feeling, I wish I could do that. I wish I could, you know, because I have all these customers all buying, thousands upon thousands of customers all buying different things. I wanted them to buy the one thing that I was trying to sell them. And I had hundreds of employees, all bright and ambitious and all with their own ideas. But I wanted them to embrace the one or two initiatives I thought needed to be prioritized.
Right.
But I had no idea how to do that. And I kind of put the idea away. And then 2 years later, I was in Silicon Valley and everybody was talking about social networks. And we had a very large digital business. And I said, this is something I should really know about. So I started researching network science. And what I found was a nearly perfect mathematical explanation for almost everything that happened during the Orange Revolution.
Amazing.
And that's what got me hooked. So I started researching movements and writing about it. And then I published something in Harvard Business Review, and a very famous revolutionary, probably the most successful modern revolutionary, a guy named Srđan Popović, who he led the movement that overthrew Milosevic, and then he's been advising, essentially overthrowing countries for a living for the past 20 years. He tweeted it out, and I got in touch with him, and we started talking. I said, listen, you're like a huge hero for me. And he said, well, we've been following your work for years.
Wow.
and we sort of connected. And what I learned was he had this repeatable model for overthrowing a country that I experienced in Ukraine, but I didn't know what was behind it. And I thought to myself, this would be an excellent model for organizational change. And we can harness the power of political and social movements for organizations. And that's the idea that became Cascades and the Cascades methodology. And what I found is this, because I spent most of my career outside the US, so I didn't have this experience with change management consultants, but there's this entire field of change management which doesn't work, and nobody even thinks it works. But this methodology of social and political movements, we've shown it actually does work.
Amazing.
And you can make massive organizational change. But here's the thing, Ashutosh. You have to address resistance first.
Correct.
Because anytime you try and make a significant impact, there's going to be people who aren't going to like it. Often for reasons of identity, dignity, or whatever, sense of self. And you need to overcome that resistance first. And you need to plan for that from the start. How are you going to overcome the resistance? If you're not going to do, if you're not willing to do that, you're just not being serious, and you won't succeed.
Correct. Well said. And can you share an example of how some organization actually was able to apply the principles from Cascades for transformation?
Yeah, there's one. I mean, most of them, of course, I can't share, but there's one that
don't give any names. Don't give any names at all.
Well, this I can, because it's been shared publicly and it's been published. So there was some guys at Procter and Gamble, and this one guy, he had a big success, and this is secret. He can't even tell me what he did exactly, but he won a Pathfinder Award from the CTO. And he said to the CTO, you know, I'd really like to apply what I've learned to the company as a whole. She said, okay, we'll give you some dance. And they gave him some executive sponsorship. And just as this was happening, Cascades was coming out. And he read the book, he went through the workshop, and within I forget what the time frame was, but within a year or something, he created a movement of 1,800 people within Procter and Gamble.
Wow.
And that was, 4 years ago. Today it's 60,000.
Amazing.
60,000 people. Even in a company the size of Procter and Gamble,
It's
that's a
huge.
really big deal.
Absolutely.
And now, of course, he's been asked to, other people from other parts of the company are asking him to come and help them deliver transformation to their parts of the organization.
Amazing.
So it really is. He's done an absolutely amazing job with it.
Absolutely.
It's really
fantastic. Thank you for sharing that example. Greg, you also stress the importance of collaboration and networks in driving innovation and change. How can businesses foster a culture of collaboration to maximize the potential for success?
You know, it's interesting, and I don't want to go too far into. I mean, Amy Edmondson has done wonderful work on psychological safety. There's a new book out, relatively new, David McRaney, How Minds Change. And there's what he focused, and there's actually a number of books about persuasion that have come out. And I think the reason is, and this is an interesting innovation story. I think that video has a lot to do with the story, how cheap video has become.
Correct.
Because each of these methodologies, which have arisen over the last 10 years or so, they were much aided because they videotaped them trying to persuade people of this or that or the other. Deep canvassing is one, street epistemology is another. The third is based on the methods of therapists that they use with their patients. But again, they all start out with safety. How do you create safety around this conversation? And we do something similar in our workshops. We call it shifting from differentiating values to shared values. Now, anybody who's ever taken a marketing course, they know the idea of a value proposition. You're supposed to differentiate yourself. How is this idea different from every other idea? And that's a good idea when it comes to positioning, but getting people to adopt an idea, you need to make that shift from differentiating values to shared values.
Correct.
How it's similar to what people already feel. And a great example of this is agile methodologies. Where anybody who's ever seen anybody come back from an agile workshop, they seem a bit strange. And they want to talk about the Agile Manifesto because that's what makes them passionate, the differentiating values, about switching from technical specifications to stories, all these things that they love about Agile. But if you want to bring people in, you don't want to focus on how Agile is different. You want to focus on shared values, such as better projects, done faster and cheaper.
Correct.
And so that shift from differentiating values to shared values helps build that safety around the conversation. And once you build safety around the conversation and build that atmosphere of shared values and shared purpose, that's when you can start introducing the differences. But you need to establish shared values and shared purpose from the outset.
Well said. Thank you. Great response. So I have time for two more questions for you. My next question is that given all the work that you've done on innovation transformation, how do you see the future of innovation and transformation evolving, given the incredible advancements in technology?
Well, one thing I think we need to get away from this idea that innovation in technology means digital technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to hold ourselves accountable for
Mm-hmm.
the failures of the digital revolution,
Okay.
because it has not gone well.
Mm.
It was supposed to change the world, but we have not seen increased productivity growth.
Mm.
We
Okay.
have not seen, at least in the OECD countries, significant increase in incomes or well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we're moving into a post-digital world where we're increasingly using bits to drive atoms in things like synthetic biology,
Mm-hmm.
CRISPR, mRNA, incredible advancements
Mm-hmm.
in material science, advanced manufacturing.
Mm.
We need to take a hard look at the digital revolution,
Mm.
and quantum is another exciting technology.
Mm.
We need to take a hard look at the digital revolution,
Mm-hmm.
think about what went wrong,
Mm.
and to think a little bit less about disruption and more about grand challenges.
Mm-hmm.
How can we solve the really, really big problems
Mm.
rather than in digital, mostly thinking, because the digital revolution has been mostly about software and consumer gadgets.
Mm-hmm.
But when you need to solve big problems,
Mm-hmm.
and you've seen this yourself in your career, when you're talking about $1 billion factory,
Mm.
you can't just move fast and break things.
Mm.
When you're talking, about a vaccine during a pandemic, you can't just wing it. So we need to get away from this culture of disruption
Mm-hmm.
and think about grand challenges. How
Mm.
can we solve the really, really big problems?
Mm. Well said. And my last question to you, Greg, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey that you've had in Europe, in what used to be the Eastern Bloc, your books, and everything else that you are doing, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your own journey and from our conversation?
I'm going to chintz on you and give you just one.
Fair enough.
It's not a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna take your knocks.
Yeah.
And the one interesting thing I learned, especially from my research into revolutions and transformational leaders, almost all of them, if you look at social movements or political revolutions throughout history, the civil rights movement is the one real exception to this. They all had terrible failures. Gandhi had his Himalayan miscalculation with Amritsar. The women's suffrage movement, the first March on Washington, was an absolute disaster. Mandela had Sharpsville. There, you look at all of them. They all had these terrible failures. And it was what they learned from those failures that made them such a huge success. You really couldn't have had the Salt March if you didn't have Amritsar. You couldn't have same-sex marriage in the States if you didn't have Proposition 8. Proposition 8. So it's, and I think that's what you look at Steve Jobs and you see the iPhone, you don't see him getting fired from the company he founded. And that's what I wish somebody had told me. That because when you take your knocks and you feel like you've been knocked on the path and you'll never get back. That's the point at which you can really learn, and you can learn the things you need to know to actually tackle the challenges that matter.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, Greg, and your amazing lesson, which is such a powerful and such a wise lesson, it's not a straight line, and that can really be applied to life. It can be applied to transformation. It can be applied to whatever each one of us is doing. Thank you for talking to me about your own journey, about both your books. Thank you for talking to me at such length about transformation and how Cascades seems to embody a lot of the thoughts that you have learned and picked up with your life in the Eastern European countries and from revolutions. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashutosh. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.